The entire town gathered to watch Ethan Walker lose everything. Because overnight, 15 junk cars appeared in his driveway. Not one, not two, 15. Rusted, broken, worthless. And by sunrise, the city had already given him 30 days to get rid of them. Most people thought it was a cruel prank. It wasn't. It was a carefully planned attack by someone powerful who wanted his land. What nobody could understand was why Ethan wasn't angry, why he wasn't panicking, why every evening after work he walked past Aldebaran cars and smiled. 3 months later, the woman who sent those cars was forced to sell the biggest dealership in town. And somehow, Ethan Walker ended up owning it. A cold October wind drifted across Redwood Falls, Montana. Gray clouds hung low over the valley, and the cottonwood trees along Cartwright Road shed their yellow leaves onto the damp ground. Ethan Walker had lived on the same piece of land for almost 9 years. The small property sat on the edge of Redwood Falls, where the town slowly gave way to open fields and rolling hills. It wasn't a large place. The white paint on the farmhouse had faded years ago, and the old wooden fence needed repairs in several places. But to Ethan, it was home. At 38 years old, Ethan Walker looked like the kind of man most people forgot about 5 minutes after meeting him. He stood just over 6 feet tall, lean rather than muscular, with broad shoulders, earned through years of physical labor. His dark brown hair was always kept short, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a face marked by quiet endurance rather than confidence. There was a faint scar above his right eyebrow, a reminder of a workplace accident from years earlier. His gray-blue eyes were calm and observant, the eyes of someone who listened far more than he spoke. People in Redwood Falls often described Ethan as polite, but distant. They weren't wrong. Losing his wife, Emily, to a sudden illness 7 years earlier had changed him in ways most people never understood. Before her death, he had been more outgoing, more willing to trust others. Afterward, he learned to keep his thoughts to himself. The grief never truly left him. It simply became part of who he was. The center of Ethan's life was his daughter. Grace Walker was 8 years old and looked remarkably like her mother. She had long chestnut hair that often escaped its ponytail, bright green eyes, and a habit of asking questions that made adults pause before answering. Unlike many children her age, Grace preferred listening to talking. She noticed details others ignored and often surprised people with observations far beyond her years. Every morning followed the same routine. Ethan woke before sunrise. Coffee, breakfast, 3 gentle knocks on Grace's bedroom door. Then school. The routine helped him keep moving forward. Some mornings, that was enough. On this particular Tuesday morning, Ethan was repairing a broken fence near the road when his neighbor appeared. Lucas Bennett was 51 years old, a broad-shouldered rancher with weathered skin, thick gray hair, and hands that looked permanently stained by years of hard work. He had lived in Redwood Falls his entire life and possessed the kind of straightforward honesty that made people trust him immediately. Lucas climbed over the fence and approached with concern already visible on his face. "Ethan," he said, "you hear about the highway project?" Ethan hammered one final nail before looking up. "A little." Lucas sighed. "They bought almost everything." Ethan nodded. He already knew. Over the past year, developers had purchased nearly every parcel of land along the proposed highway expansion route. Families who had lived there for generations accepted offers and moved away. Some left happily. Others left because they had no choice. Lucas shifted his weight uneasily. Victoria Sterling isn't giving up. The name hung in the air. Everyone in Montana's western counties knew who Victoria Sterling was. At 46 years old, Victoria had built Sterling Automotive Group into the largest dealership network in the region. She was tall, elegant, and intimidating without ever raising her voice. Her blonde hair was always perfectly styled. Her tailored suits cost more than many local families spent in a month. People often described her as brilliant. Others described her as ruthless. Both descriptions were true. Victoria believed every problem had a solution, and every person had a price. The only thing she disliked more than losing money was hearing the word no. Unfortunately for her, Ethan Walker had already said it 3 times. 3 separate offers. 3 separate refusals. No explanation. Just no. That bothered her more than it should have. Because in Victoria's world, everyone eventually agreed. Everyone, except Ethan. That afternoon, nearly 80 miles away in her corporate office overlooking downtown Billings, Victoria Sterling stared through floor-to-ceiling windows while reviewing property acquisition reports. Her assistant, Rachel Cooper, sat across from her desk. Rachel was 32, sharp-minded, efficient, and professional enough to survive working for Victoria. She wore dark glasses and kept her brown hair tied back in a practical bun. "Still refusing?" Victoria asked. Rachel nodded. "Completely." Victoria leaned back. Most people mistook her silence for patience. It wasn't. It was calculation. She studied Ethan's file again. Single father. Mechanic. Limited income. No political influence. No major assets besides the property. The kind of man who should have been easy to move. Yet somehow, he remained exactly where he was. Victoria tapped her finger against the desk. Then she smiled. The expression made Rachel uncomfortable, because Victoria usually smiled right before someone else's problems began. "Let's give Mr. Walker a reason to reconsider." Rachel didn't ask what that meant. Experience had taught her not to. The following morning, Ethan woke at 5:30 as usual. Everything seemed normal, until he opened the front door. For several seconds, he simply stood there. The coffee mug in his hand slowly cooled. Grace appeared beside him wearing oversized pajamas and rubbing sleep from her eyes. Then she froze too. 15 vehicles filled the driveway. Rust-covered sedans, broken trucks, missing windows, flat tires, collapsed suspensions. They stretched from the road all the way to the garage. Every single one looked completely worthless. The town would begin talking within hours. Ethan already knew that. Grace looked up at him. "Dad?" He didn't answer. Across the road, neighbors were beginning to stop and stare. Phones appeared. Pictures were taken. And somewhere far away, Victoria Sterling was probably expecting panic. Instead, Ethan quietly stepped off the porch. His eyes moved across all 15 vehicles, one by one, slowly, carefully, as though he were seeing something nobody else could. The story of the 15 junk cars spread across Redwood Falls faster than anyone expected. By the second afternoon, photographs of Ethan Walker's driveway had appeared in local social media groups, coffee shop conversations, and nearly every diner booth in town. Most people viewed the situation as entertainment. Some viewed it as a tragedy. Almost nobody believed it could become an opportunity. Ethan ignored all of it. Instead, he spent that evening moving slowly between the vehicles with a flashlight, a notebook, and a magnet. Grace followed him from a distance, sitting on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket, while the Montana sunset painted the horizon orange and purple. She noticed something strange. Her father wasn't inspecting the cars like someone trying to calculate a problem. He looked more like a man greeting old acquaintances. "What are you looking for?" Grace finally asked. Ethan crouched beside a rust-covered pickup truck and ran his fingers along the frame. "The truth," he answered. Grace frowned. "They look broken." "Most things do." That answer stayed with her. The next morning, Ethan requested 3 unpaid vacation days from the community garage where he worked. His manager approved immediately. The manager, Harold Pierce, was a stocky 60-year-old mechanic with silver hair, thick glasses, and permanently oil-stained hands. Harold had spent 40 years repairing farm equipment and diesel engines. Beneath his rough exterior was a fiercely loyal man who never forgot kindness. Years earlier, when Ethan first arrived in Redwood Falls after losing his wife, Harold had been one of the few people who offered him work without asking uncomfortable questions. By sunrise, the first vehicle sat inside Ethan's garage. The process looked almost effortless. Bolts came loose. Parts were cleaned. Connections were repaired. Problems revealed themselves under Ethan's careful hands. What surprised Lucas Bennett most was not Ethan's skill, but his certainty. Ethan rarely stopped to think. He already seemed to know what was wrong before opening anything. 3 days later, the first vehicle rolled out of the garage under its own power. The old sedan wasn't beautiful, but it ran, and somebody bought it before sunset. Then another vehicle entered the garage, then another. Within 2 weeks, 4 vehicles had been repaired and sold. People started paying attention. The jokes became questions. The questions became curiosity. One afternoon, Lucas leaned against the garage doorway while Ethan worked. "You ever going to tell me where you learned all this?" For several seconds, Ethan continued tightening a component before answering. "Michigan." That was all. Lucas waited. Eventually, Ethan sighed. 12 years earlier, before Emily's illness and before Montana, Ethan had worked for a company called Great Lakes Restoration in Detroit. While most mechanics repaired ordinary vehicles, Great Lakes specialized in restoring rare collector cars worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Ethan had started as an apprentice. He left as one of their most respected restoration specialists. The work demanded patience, precision, and an eye for details others missed. After Emily became sick, however, none of it seemed important anymore. He left Michigan. He left the career. And eventually he left behind almost every reminder of that life. Except the skills. Those remained. That evening, Ethan turned his attention toward the 9th vehicle in the row. At first glance, it appeared worthless. The paint was a disaster. 4 different colors covered the body in uneven layers. Most of the interior was missing. The windshield was shattered. The suspension sagged badly, yet something bothered him. The proportions felt wrong. The lines beneath the damaged bodywork seemed familiar. He spent nearly an hour examining it, without touching a single tool. Then he slowly walked back to the house. Later that night, after Grace was asleep, Ethan opened an old contact list stored inside a metal file cabinet. One name immediately caught his attention: Nathan Holloway. Nathan was 63 years old and lived outside Dallas, Texas. Tall and thin with white hair, sharp features, and the kind of memory that could identify rare automobiles from a single photograph, Nathan had spent decades building one of the most respected private collections in the Southwest. During Ethan's years in Detroit, Nathan had purchased several restored vehicles from Great Lakes Restoration. The 2 men hadn't spoken in nearly 7 years. Nathan answered on the second ring. "Ethan Walker," the older man said immediately. "Either I've won the lottery, or you've found something interesting." Ethan smiled for the first time all day. Maybe both. The following morning, he sent 60 detailed photographs. The response arrived less than an hour later. Nathan called back, sounding unusually excited. "Ethan," he said quietly, "do you have any idea what you're looking at?" Ethan already suspected. Beneath 4 layers of paint and years of neglect sat an exceptionally rare classic performance car that collectors had spent years searching for. Someone, somewhere, had failed to recognize its value. A week later, after additional verification, Nathan offered $45,000, cash, no negotiation, transport included. When the deal was finalized, Ethan stood alone in the garage, staring at the transfer documents. For a long moment, he thought about Emily, about the hospital bills, about the years spent struggling to provide for Grace, about all the doors that had closed. And then he thought about something else. The person who had placed 15 junk cars in his driveway believed they had buried him. Instead, they had delivered the first piece of a much larger opportunity. For the first time since the cars arrived, Ethan wasn't simply reacting anymore. He was beginning to plan. The $45,000 from the rare car sale changed something important, but not in the way most people assumed. It wasn't the money itself. It was the realization that someone with power had made a serious mistake. Ethan Walker understood machines well enough to know that small failures often revealed larger weaknesses hidden beneath the surface. Businesses were not very different. Meanwhile, Victoria Sterling was growing impatient. 3 weeks had passed since the 15 junk cars appeared in Ethan's driveway. Instead of becoming desperate, the quiet mechanic seemed to be improving his situation. Worse, the story had started attracting attention throughout Redwood Falls. People who had laughed at first were now stopping by simply to watch Ethan work. Victoria disliked unpredictability. She sat in her office overlooking downtown Billings, reviewing reports with increasing irritation. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected her sharp features and perfectly styled blonde hair. At 46, she remained composed under pressure, but beneath that calm exterior lived a fierce determination that had carried her from inheriting a single dealership to building a regional empire. Years earlier, after her father suffered a devastating business betrayal that nearly bankrupted the family, Victoria had learned a lesson she never forgot. Control everything. Trust nothing. The lesson had made her successful. It had also made her dangerous. Across the desk sat Rachel Cooper, who had learned to recognize warning signs. Victoria's voice became quieter when she was angry. "Has the city responded?" Victoria asked. Rachel nodded carefully. "The zoning department sent another notice." Victoria smiled faintly. "Good." The second notice accused Ethan of operating an unauthorized vehicle sales business from residential property. It wasn't a criminal matter, but it could create delays, legal expenses, and pressure. Exactly the outcome Victoria wanted. When Ethan received the letter, he read it once and placed it beside the first notice. Then he returned to work. That evening, after Grace went to sleep, Ethan made a phone call. The lawyer who answered was Daniel Mercer. Daniel was 54 years old, tall and slender, with thinning silver hair and intelligent brown eyes hidden behind rectangular glasses. Unlike many attorneys, he spoke slowly and listened carefully before offering opinions. 20 years earlier, Daniel had nearly lost his own law practice after trusting the wrong business partner. The experience left him cautious, methodical, and highly skilled at identifying risks hidden inside contracts. The two men had met years earlier through a vehicle restoration client. After reviewing the notices, Daniel laughed softly. "Victoria Sterling is trying to make your life expensive. Can she? Not if we stay ahead of her." Over the following weeks, Daniel helped Ethan establish every permit, filing, and document necessary to remain completely compliant. The notices continued. None succeeded. Victoria grew increasingly frustrated. For the first time, Ethan decided to stop reacting and start asking questions. Who exactly was Victoria Sterling? What kind of business was she really running? The answers surprised him. Public records revealed that Sterling Automotive Group had expanded aggressively during the previous 4 years. New buildings, new inventory, new financing agreements. The growth looked impressive, but growth often came at a price. Daniel introduced Ethan to another professional. Mason Reed was a commercial banking consultant from Helena. At 60 years old, Mason possessed a weathered face, a neatly trimmed gray mustache, and the calm confidence of someone who had spent 3 decades studying financial statements. He had helped banks evaluate struggling businesses and knew how to read numbers the way mechanics read engines. When Ethan showed him the available records, Mason spent several days reviewing them. The answer arrived during a phone call. "Your businesswoman has a problem." Ethan listened. Mason explained that Sterling Automotive Group carried several $1 million in commercial debt tied to expansion projects. Rising interest rates had dramatically increased borrowing costs. Sales growth had slowed. Inventory expenses were climbing. None of it meant immediate collapse, but it created vulnerability. The kind lenders watched closely, the kind competitors waited for, the kind smart investors noticed. For several moments, Ethan remained silent. His eyes drifted toward the remaining vehicles still parked outside. The entire situation suddenly felt different. Victoria had looked at 15 broken cars and seen garbage. Ethan had looked at the same vehicles and found opportunity. Now he was beginning to suspect she had made the same mistake somewhere else. She might have overlooked value. She might have underestimated risk. Most importantly, she might have underestimated him. Later that night, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table after everyone else was asleep. Stacks of paperwork covered the surface: vehicle sales records, property documents, financial reports, bank filings. The pieces did not yet form a complete picture, but they were starting to fit together. Outside, the Montana wind rattled the trees. Inside, Ethan opened a fresh notebook. At the top of the first page, he wrote 2 words: Sterling Auto. Then he began making a plan. Winter arrived early in Redwood Falls. A thin layer of frost covered the grass each morning, and the mountains beyond town wore fresh snow across their peaks. The colder weather seemed to sharpen everything, including the tension that had quietly grown between Ethan Walker and Victoria Sterling. By late November, most of the 15 junk cars were gone. Some had been repaired and sold. Others had been dismantled for valuable components. The rare collector car had provided enough capital to give Ethan something he had not possessed in years: options. For nearly 7 years after Emily's death, his life had revolved around survival: paying bills, raising Grace, making sure there was food on the table and heat in the house. Now, for the first time in a long time, he could think beyond next month. That realization was both exciting and frightening. Ethan had learned long ago that opportunities often carried risks hidden beneath them. The monthly Redwood Falls Development Council meeting was scheduled for the 3rd Thursday evening. Normally, attendance was modest. Local business owners discussed permits, road maintenance, and zoning issues. This meeting was different. Word had spread that Victoria Sterling planned to make another public proposal regarding the remaining properties along the highway corridor. Nearly every seat was filled. Reporters attended. Business owners attended. Curious residents attended. Even people who normally avoided town meetings showed up. Victoria arrived precisely on time. She wore a charcoal gray business suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. Though recent financial pressures had begun affecting her privately, very little showed on the surface. She remained poised, intelligent, and intimidating. Ethan arrived a few minutes later. Unlike Victoria, he wore a simple dark jacket over a plaid shirt. Nothing about him suggested wealth. Nothing about him suggested ambition. Yet many people found themselves watching him more closely than Victoria. Among the crowd sat Rebecca Lawson, a local journalist for the Redwood Falls Chronicle. Rebecca was 34 years old, with curly auburn hair, freckles across her cheeks, and sharp hazel eyes that missed very little. She had built her reputation by focusing on facts instead of gossip, which made her one of the few reporters Ethan actually respected. The meeting began normally. Infrastructure, traffic projections, commercial development plans. Then Victoria stood and presented the final phase of her highway development proposal. A large map appeared on the screen. Every property had been acquired. Every parcel except one. The Walker property. Victoria spoke professionally and without visible hostility. She explained how the final acquisition would complete the project and benefit the local economy. Additional jobs, increased tax revenue, new commercial opportunities. Then she turned toward Ethan. Mr. Walker remains the only remaining property owner who has declined participation. The room grew quiet. People expected another refusal. What they received was something else entirely. Ethan stood slowly. For several seconds, he simply looked around the room. At the people he had known for years. At the neighbors who had watched him struggle after Emily died. At the strangers who only knew rumors. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm. My wife lived in that house. The room became still. She spent her final months there. Nobody interrupted. Grace was born there. Ethan paused briefly. His thoughts drifted toward Emily's smile, her laughter, the sound of her voice that sometimes still echoed inside his memory. I promised her I would keep that home for our daughter. Several people lowered their eyes. Even those who disagreed with him understood. Some things simply weren't for sale. Victoria listened without expression. Yet something about Ethan's honesty unsettled her. It wasn't emotional manipulation. It wasn't anger. It was conviction, the kind that could not be negotiated. Then Ethan surprised everyone, including Victoria. I also have a proposal. Several heads turned. Rebecca Lawson immediately reached for her notebook. Ethan continued. Over the past few months, I've spent time studying local businesses. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. And I'd like to formally offer to purchase Sterling Automotive's flagship dealership here in Montana at fair market value. Silence. Absolute silence. The kind that arrives when a room suddenly loses its ability to process what it has heard. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. One man near the back actually laughed once before realizing Ethan was serious. Victoria stared at him. For perhaps the first time in years, she had no prepared response. Ethan wasn't smiling. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't seeking revenge. He appeared completely sincere. That made the moment even more shocking. Rebecca's pen moved furiously across the page. Council members exchanged confused glances. Lucas Bennett nearly dropped his coffee. Finally, Victoria found her voice. You want to buy my dealership? Yes. Why? The answer came immediately. Because I think it's worth more than people realize. The irony landed throughout the room almost instantly. Several people exchanged looks. Victoria understood it too. Months earlier, she had looked at 15 junk cars and seen nothing but worthless metal. Ethan had seen opportunity. Now he was looking at her struggling dealership the same way. For the first time since this conflict began, Victoria wasn't thinking several moves ahead. She was simply trying to understand the man standing in front of her. The meeting ended shortly afterward. People left in stunned silence. Outside, snowflakes drifted through the cold Montana air. Ethan walked toward his truck. Behind him, conversations erupted across the parking lot. Nobody was talking about the highway anymore. They were talking about Ethan Walker. And for the first time, Victoria Sterling was no longer controlling the story. The first heavy snowfall of December arrived the same week the final documents were signed. White covered the streets of Redwood Falls, softening the sharp edges of fences, rooftops, and empty fields. From a distance, the town looked peaceful. Few people would have guessed how much had changed during the previous 2 months. The acquisition process had not been simple. Lawyers reviewed contracts. Banks verified financing. Inspectors evaluated assets. Every detail required attention. Ethan Walker insisted on understanding every page before signing anything. Years of rebuilding damaged vehicles had taught him that hidden problems often appeared where people failed to look closely enough. The final agreement was completed 63 days after the town council meeting. By every legal definition, Ethan Walker now owned the largest automobile dealership in Redwood Falls. The news spread quickly. Some people called it unbelievable. Others called it impossible. A few still refused to believe it. Yet the documents existed. The signatures existed. Reality did not care what people believed. One of Ethan's first decisions surprised nearly everyone. No employees would be dismissed. Not one. Several workers expected layoffs. Many had spent weeks worrying about their future. The dealership employed 23 people whose livelihoods depended upon the business remaining stable. Ethan understood that responsibility. One Monday morning, he gathered everyone in the showroom before opening. The atmosphere felt tense. People shifted nervously. Nobody knew what kind of owner he would become. Standing near the front was Michael Torres, the dealership service manager. Michael was 48 years old, broad-shouldered and heavily built, with dark hair beginning to gray around the temples. Years earlier, he had served as a marine mechanic before transitioning into civilian automotive work. His military background made him skeptical of promises and respectful only of actions. Michael watched Ethan carefully. So did everyone else. Ethan stepped forward. "You all have jobs." The room remained silent. "You had jobs yesterday. You'll have jobs tomorrow." Relief moved visibly through the crowd. Several shoulders relaxed. A few employees exchanged looks. One woman quietly wiped away tears. Ethan continued, "I didn't buy this place to tear it apart. I bought it because I believe it's worth keeping." The meeting ended with something rare: hope. Meanwhile, Victoria Sterling was facing a very different chapter of life. For nearly 15 years, she had built her identity around expansion, acquisitions, and growth. Success had become part of how she measured her own worth. Losing control of the flagship dealership forced her to confront questions she had spent years avoiding. Surprisingly, she handled it better than most expected. Under the transition agreement, Victoria remained a consultant for 6 months. Every Tuesday, she met with Ethan to review supplier contracts and operational challenges. At first, their conversations were cautious, professional, guarded. Over time, something unexpected developed. Respect. Not friendship. Not yet. But respect. Victoria eventually admitted something during one meeting. "I thought you were protecting a piece of land." Ethan looked up from a report. "I was." Victoria shook her head. No, you were protecting something much bigger. For once, Ethan didn't disagree. A few days before Christmas, Ethan closed the dealership early and brought Grace to visit. The little girl wandered through the showroom with wide eyes, examining everything. She touched polished vehicles, peeked into offices, asked dozens of questions. Employees smiled whenever she appeared. When they reached the service department, Grace pointed toward a hose lying across the floor. "Someone could trip on that." Michael Torres immediately laughed and moved it. The workers found themselves smiling more often than they had in months. Later that evening, father and daughter drove home through falling snow. The road was quiet. The sky was dark. Christmas lights glowed warmly in farmhouse windows. When they arrived home, Ethan did something he had not done in a long time. He invited Grace into the old garage. The building smelled of oil, wood, and memories. A single overhead light illuminated the vehicle resting beneath a protective cover. Grace watched silently as Ethan pulled the cover away. The pale mint green classic car appeared beneath it. The paint reflected the light softly. Every detail had been restored. Every line looked perfect. Grace stared. "It's beautiful." Ethan smiled. "It is." She walked around the car slowly. "Are you going to sell it?" For a moment, Ethan didn't answer. His hand rested on the hood. The color transported him backward through time. Years earlier, Emily had pointed at a passing car in Detroit and laughed. "If I ever own a car," she had said, "I want that color." The memory remained crystal clear. Some memories always did. "No," Ethan finally said. "I'm keeping this one." Grace looked curious. "Why?" Ethan glanced toward her. "Because some things are worth more than money." Grace thought about that. Then she nodded. She understood more than many adults would have. Years later, people throughout Redwood Falls would tell the story differently. Some claimed Ethan had defeated Victoria Sterling. Some claimed he had simply gotten lucky. Others focused on the dealership, the money, the business. They missed the point. The truth was much simpler. Most people saw 15 worthless junk cars. Ethan saw possibilities. Most people saw land. Ethan saw home. Most people chased value. Ethan protected what mattered. And in the end, that made all the difference. In the end, Ethan Walker's story was never really about 15 junk cars. It wasn't about a dealership. And it wasn't even about winning. It was about seeing value where everyone else saw nothing. Sometimes life feels exactly the same. We lose a job. We face illness. We watch doors close one after another and wonder why God would allow it to happen. What looks like a setback today may be the very thing God is using to prepare a blessing tomorrow. The people of Redwood Falls saw a driveway full of worthless metal. Ethan saw opportunity. The world saw a struggling single father. God saw a man being prepared for something greater. Maybe that's how miracles often happen. Not through sudden flashes of light. Not through dramatic signs in the sky. But through ordinary people who keep doing the right thing when nobody is watching. Through faith when circumstances make no sense. Through perseverance when giving up would be easier. And through opportunities hidden inside the very problems we pray to escape. If you're going through a difficult season right now, don't lose hope. The thing that looks like your greatest burden today may become part of your greatest blessing tomorrow. Share in the comments. What challenge has God helped you overcome in your life? If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs encouragement today. And before you go, may God bless you, protect your family, strengthen your faith, guide your steps, and fill your home with peace, hope, and provision in the days ahead. God bless you, and thank you for watching.